the point here is that you have these two columns here in the explain-ash output that are supposed to represent the same information that you get from this activity column in the official real-time SQL monitoring output. And the other columns I've already mentioned. So we have this IO requests and IO bytes things and so on. These are the ones that I already mentioned here. If you have Exadata, you would also get here this cell offloading information column. So there would be an additional column for any smart scan activity. You would see here the actual cell offload percentage on execution plan operation level. So which is quite helpful not to only look at the total cell offload percentage, but to look at the detailed cell offload percentage per operation. So for Exadata execution plans, you would get here another column which is again only available based on real-time SQL monitoring information. So what else do we have? I think for serial plans, that's pretty much it what you get here. So there's not much more that you can get. And just to point it out again, these columns here, you would also get for a explain-ash report where the real-time SQL monitoring information is no longer available because this is based on active session history. So you would even get it from a report based on DBA active session history. You won't get this in this case. Then you won't get this information here. But again, it can be quite revealing to understand on which execution plan lines you have spent how much time and what kind of activity. Quite often it's sufficient information to understand what might have gone wrong. If it was a very long running execution, it might already give you a clue together with these estimates here that are also available. It might already give you a clue why this took so long to execute. So at least that's my experience, and that's the reason why I provide this kind of information based on active session history. For parallel plans, there is even more information available. We have here these two additional columns, parallel distribution and parallel execution skew. Well, the meaning here again, or the output here is different. At least for this column, the output is different depending on whether real-time SQL monitoring information will be shown or not, is available or requested or not. If real-time SQL monitoring information is available, you see here in these square brackets the number of output rows per process that is involved. So it's either the query coordinator process or one of the parallel slaves. So this is a key information that lets you very clearly, if it's available, very clearly see how well the distribution of rows was, at least in terms of rows that get output that are produced by an operation. So, for example, here it is very clear that these three parallel slaves here pretty evenly produced these 668 respectively 666k number of rows at a degree of 3. This is what you would like to see, that the rows, these 2 million rows, are rather evenly spread. But you can see here this effect that I already explained, I think, in the corresponding activity timeline information here, starting at this part of the execution. We see here from one of these two parallel slave sets only one parallel slave being active, or it could be a few out of this set, not necessarily only a single one. And we have then this round robin activity for the other slave set, which basically means that the other slave set is basically offloading, sending the data to this consuming slave set. But since this parallel slave, this single one, cannot consume the data quick enough, these slaves here are basically stuck and can only hand over the data in some kind of round robin fashion, and have to wait for this slave to be available again to receive the data. And the reason for this, you again can see here in this row information, in these square brackets, all of these 2 million rows were sent to this single slave. So here something definitely went wrong with the data distribution, and this is then this confirmation, or basically the proof of this way that you see from this active session history activity pattern. You can see here then very clearly and precisely shown in the real-time signal monitoring information. This is I think one of the most powerful parts of the real-time signal monitoring information for parallel execution, that you can get the row counts on parallel slave level. Unfortunately, this information is not available in the 11.2 version of the real-time signal monitoring report. It is actually available in a very obscure way. It is actually usually available in the official real-time signal monitoring report starting from version 12. If the real-time signal monitoring detects a skew, or uneven distribution, then you will see here this drop-down box. If it doesn't detect it, I think this box is not shown, so it is not always available in parallel plan real-time signal monitoring output. But if the real-time signal monitoring output detects this skew, then you will see here this drop-down box where you can start to pick some specific parallel slaves. I have no idea why they have implemented it this way, but what happens if you then now pick one of these slaves, that's pick number 2 here, then this information here basically will then filter it down to this slave that you have just selected in this drop-down box, and we can see here then this 2 million rows here confirmed, but I find it rather obscure. No idea why they have implemented it that way, so that you have to pick here some of these one of these parallel slaves, and then this information here will be filtered. Also, you can see here this so-called skew ratio. Again, I have really problems understanding what this skew ratio is supposed to tell me, because for those operations where we have this skew, the skew ratio is actually not shown. So again, I'm not really sure what this is supposed to tell me. So by default, you show here the summary or the aggregated information for all parallel slaves, but you can pick here then one of them. In Explain-Ash, I use a different approach, as I've just explained. So you see here all the involved parallel slaves, and if a row count is available, it is shown in square brackets. So for example, you can see here this 0 means that these parallel slaves actually didn't produce any rows. If the real-time signal monitoring information is not available, then these square brackets information simply will be missing from this output. But what will be there always is what you see here in this parenthesis. And I know this looks a little bit messy, and you probably have to get used to reading it. And I even have a configuration option in the script that in older versions of Explain-Ash, if a process is not sampled, so it's not sampled in active session history, in older versions of Explain-Ash, then these processes won't be shown here. So which makes this a little bit more, well, a little bit less messy, this section, because only those processes where this sample count is larger than 0 will be shown. But I decided to change this in more recent versions because I find it more informative if the real-time signal monitoring information is available, to show the actual row counts in these square brackets, even if the process was not sampled in active session history, like this example here. So this process was actually not sampled, but still it's probably very helpful to understand how many rows it produced, and that's the reason why I have changed this to this little bit more messy looking output, where you see all the processes that are involved even if they are not sampled. So the meaning of this information here in this parenthesis behind the process is the number of active session history samples. Yeah, so that information, as I said, since this is based on active session history, this kind of information will always be shown. Again, this is usually quite helpful on its own, because again, it gives you an idea about the work distribution. So if you have a problem with the work distribution, then not only the row counts are revealing, but also the activity pattern that you get from the active session history samples. For example, here it is very obvious that this P002 then was much more active for this execution plan line than any other process involved. So you can see here from this sampling, compare it to this one here. So you see here, in this case here, the processes are very evenly distributed from the row counts, and you also get the same even distribution in terms of sampling. So you see here this P004 12 samples, P003 12 samples, and P005. So this set here 3, 4, 5, the other set is 0, 1, 2. This set 3, 4, 5 for this plan operation here has a very even distribution. That's the way it's ideally should look like, that all of them have a very similar number of samples per execution plan line. Actually, I have no idea why P004 shows up here again. Looks like either a bug in my script or in the real-time signal monitoring output. Something I have to check. We see here again these duplicates here. Strange. Anyway, the point here is that even if the real-time signal monitoring information, these row counts, are not available, you will always get this sample information. So this shows you how many samples each process per execution plan line was found in the active session history. And based on this information here, how many samples how many samples per execution plan line per process were found, is used by Explain-Ash to populate this column here, which is supposed to give you an idea, a graphical representation of which execution plan lines were involved when the overall activity level was less than the actual degree. So the idea is, for example, in this case here, this part of the execution plan is, I think, was supposed to be executed at a degree of 3. If the execution activity at a certain sample point, like this here, like I explained in the previous part, so in this case here we only have 2 active processes, which is less than the degree. The degree here is 3. This is what you get from these square brackets here. So the actual degree is 3, but we only have 2 active sessions. So for each sample point where the activity level, the actual activity level is less than the degree, Explain-Ash basically marks this corresponding execution plan line internally and says, okay, this execution plan line was involved when this happened, that less processes were active than the actual degree. And this graph then basically represents for how many sample points a corresponding execution plan line was active in relation to the total duration. So this means if you would see here a graph, a bar that would go, which would cover the whole beginning to end part, then this would mean that this execution plan line was involved from start to beginning of the execution, and for each of these samples there were less processes active than the degree, the actual degree. So this should represent some, let's say, some weight or some severity. The larger this bar graph is, the more sample points this execution plan line was involved in relation to the total execution when less processes were active than the degree. So in total we could say here something like these two, we have some at least 1/3 or so of the execution time, 1/3 of the total execution time we have here, where these two execution plan lines were active when less processes were active than the degree, which, as you see, pretty much corresponds to the execution plan lines that we see here also, that were involved in the uneven distribution based on the row on the row's output here. So you see here this part is here is the distribution where the distribution went wrong. So this is a px send receive pair here. This is as we see here in the plan, this is the send and receive operation where things went wrong here in this case. As I already pointed out, you can have many of these send and receive operations where things can go wrong, so you don't have necessarily only a single part of an execution plan where this can go wrong. In principle, at each px send receive operation this can go wrong. In this case here we have this operation where things went wrong with the distribution, and basically the following operations are then affected as well, because there was no further redistribution performed. So this was the send receive operation where things went wrong, and this hash join and this load as select then as a side effect of this then were affected as well, because they were basically also affected by the same problem, because still these 2 million rows were processed by this P002 process, and that's the reason why we see then here this part of the execution plan and this part of the execution plan marked, highlighted by Explain-Ash, because these are the plan lines that were shown as active in the active session history when this scenario, this less processes active than degree, was happening during execution. So that is the idea of this column here for parallel execution, that you get an easy identification which parts of the execution plan you have to focus on, where things with the distribution might have gone wrong. And since this is based, this part at least, is based on active session history, you get this information even if the real-time signal monitoring is missing. So even if you do not have it that clearly shown with the row count output, the rows produced information, usually based on this Explain-Ash graph here, it's quite obvious which distribution operations you have to focus on, where things went wrong with the data distribution. And this even works with plans, with more complex plans. For example, if you have a partition granule parallel operation that is not based on these kind of distributions here, but you, for example, have a full partition-wise join, and the partitions are not of the same size, which might happen, then again, Explain-Ash would show you here that some of these processes had to work more than the others because they had to work on these larger partitions, and you would see this even without the row count output, simply based on the on the active session history sampling. So that's the power of this active session history sampling that Explain-Ash then tries to use here to give you this idea about this parallel execution skew information. All right, what else do I have? I think I already talked about this. You can get similar about this skew information. You can get a little bit similar information from this activity graph here in the version 12 of real-time signal monitoring. If you use this by plan line option here, this drop-down box is not available in the 11.2 and the previous versions of the real-time signal monitoring report. Well, you would see here the plan lines, and I think you could then deduce basically for those parts where we have less activity than the degree. But then again, we are affected here by this bug that it does this double accounting. So it looks like we have here actually 3 or more processes active, but in fact, if you would check the underlying raw data, then you would see here that as I said, only less than only 2 or less processes would be active here. So so in this case, this is not a good example, but assuming you would see here less than these 3 represented by this line, you could deduce here that this line 4 here of this execution plan, this line 4 was active during this period, which would give you a clue which part of the execution plan you have to focus on. So this is I think, yeah, well, depending on how you look at it, I think it is less obvious than having simply this plan line here, this information. Sorry. It's probably. I think it's more obvious to have this clear graphical indication about which execution plan lines were involved when this skew happened, rather than this a little bit more complex way of having to choose here this by plan line, then check which plan lines were active here graphically by hovering over it. So, well, but at least it's available from version 12 on. In version 11.2 you can't get this information from the official real-time signal monitoring report anyway.